Welcome to another episode of the Hic Sunt podcast, in which we discuss politics around the world. And the first topic I would like to discuss today is refers to Charles de Gaulle. Why de Gaulle? Well, he's been mentioned recently in the current political climate. When talk has again arisen about various plans to create a separate potential for Europe, separate from the United States within the NATO alliance. And this has to do with what de Gaulle had as one of his plans, was to sort of make sure that Europe is independent in its potential and capabilities from the United States. And in fact, the current US administration also has been pushing, at least rhetorically, for that. I'm not sure they would enjoy actually having it. So he's been again in the news about this idea, which for a long time has been discarded because the European states were comfortable with the U.S. protection umbrella and so on. So this could be a reason why we should discuss de Gaulle. But this is just one aspect of a bigger array or constellation of effects or impacts that de Gaulle had on politics, not just in France, but on world politics. So for those of us who don't know who de Gaulle was, just a few words about him. He was the first president of the Fifth Republic of France. So he's one of the most important political figures of the 20th century in general, but also for France, one of the most important political figures of French history. He was the president of France between 1958 and 1968, basically. He made his name, obviously, during the Second World War, when he was the voice of the Free French, right, of the Free France, yeah, while France was occupied by, was under Nazi Germany control in various forms, yeah. So a few words about de Gaulle then. He was born in 1890, very few words. Born in 1890, participated in World War I. He was in the military as a career, yeah. So participated in the First World War. By the time of the Second World War, in between these wars, he got some more, studied some more military sciences, wrote, thought about military affairs and strategies and so on. By the time World War II comes, he's a colonel in the French military. And actually, by the time World War II starts, he is made a general. And soon thereafter, he is appointed Under Secretary of State for National Defense of War, responsible for coordinating with the UK for the defense of the two countries and for armament and so on. So he had this role of connecting with London, yeah, with the government in the UK. And this is important because when the French military collapses and the government decides to surrender, which de Gaulle opposed, right, he already had this bridge to the United Kingdom. So he was in between flights. So he returns quickly to the United Kingdom and sets up his headquarters there, and then goes on the radio famously and gives those speeches, and he becomes the voice of Free France. And interesting, so he basically constructs this position or this role for himself, and this is an important thing to remember. So he becomes the voice of Free France. Then when the Allies land in Normandy on D-Day, he in the meantime, he organizes a sort of provisional government of France abroad. He organizes military basically groups of the Free French, yeah, abroad, who fight along the Allies, yeah, both in Africa, especially in Africa. And so he becomes the leader of the Free France, yeah, of the French government in exile. But all of this he sort of constructed himself. and that's one of the points we're going to touch upon. So when the Allies land, he insists and makes sure that he's the first. He and a few other French cars are the first to enter Paris, so that he can say that the French army or the French Free Army liberated Paris, which effectively was not true because the French free forces were much smaller. But it was very important for him to do this symbolic thing and to be the first to get to Paris and to sort of take control of the issues immediately. And he becomes the leader of France immediately in this end of war, immediately post-war period. But when the new constitution is written, he disagrees with the form of this constitution, because they devised a parliamentary political system, and he opposed that. The parliamentary political system is where the parliament is the most powerful entity. He wanted one in which the head of state, the president, is also head of government, where there is one person who's the most important actor. But obviously, coming after World War II, this idea of a one overwhelming person, one position, overwhelmingly controlling the whole system, coming after Hitler and so on, would not sound so appealing to the French leaders, French elites, and so on. So anyway, so he's because they write a completely different constitution, he basically retreats from politics, at least formally. But at the same time, he creates or supports the creation of a party that would support him, but he never becomes a member of that party, but sort of as to have this instrument to remain involved in French politics, while he personally was not. So it's an interesting balance, which again will pop up later. And then in 1958, there's the major crisis as part of the process of decolonization. There's the major crisis with Algeria, which was part of France, not even a colony, but part of France, and the War of Independence there, and the fact that there are millions of French people in Algeria, hundreds of thousands, probably more than a million, don't have the right exact numbers, in Algeria, who were born there but who are French. And if Algeria becomes independent, what becomes of them, and so on. So there's a huge division in French society and in French politics, and there's even the danger of a coup by the military, who oppose this abandonment of the French Algerians. And then, so basically, France is at the brink of a political disaster, and the government didn't have the authority or the force, having been the politics in France having been highly fragmented. Because being a parliamentary system, that meant that the government didn't have solid legs, because it was made of a coalition of many parties. So there wasn't anyone who could sort of withstand this threat. And the only figure which stood out in French society and politics again remained de Gaulle. And he was sort of this providential figure to whom they turned. And he kind of barely expected for this to happen. And he comes in. He becomes head of France in a preliminary fashion, and then takes this opportunity to rewrite the French Constitution. And creates the political system that is also functioning today. One of the longest lasting political system in French history after the French Revolution, since the French Revolution. And it's a political system that is a so-called semi-presidential political system, where the president is both head of state, so formal ceremonial head, and also effectively the most important actor in actually governing the country, but not the day-to-day things, but the overall big picture things. So both head of state and what I like to call head of government one, because there's also a prime minister who runs the day-to-day business, whom is appointed by the president and approved by the parliament, basically. And that's a head of government too. So it creates a political system that is fits him. But it also fits seemingly, French society, because it's been so enduring and so on. So, and then he stays in power, and there's a party that supports him. He never becomes a member of that party, but he reshapes uh, politics by creating a center-right party that is not nothing like the center-right parties that came before. And since then he, this kind of center-right in France becomes known as following the sort of the ideology of Gaullism, which is not really an ideology, but again, it just shows that it was shaped by de Gaulle, Charles de Gaulle himself. So he shaped the political system, the very way in which France works. He shaped the way and the role of the president in a unique way, creating a so-called imperial presidency that all people who came after him, or presidents who came after him, no matter from which party, actually copied and added to. He shaped party politics and ideology, reshaped the ideological sort of landscape in France. He also designed a specific role for France in Europe and in the world, a sort of a third way France, a tradition of unilateralism, which we will talk about in a second. So he's shaped France internally and externally in a way that we cannot understand French politics or the role of France today in the world without understanding de Gaulle. Yeah, his reign, as it were, ends in 1968. He resigns, although he just won overwhelmingly an election. He resigns because he loses a referendum. Yeah, a referendum is when the population is asked to say yes or no, and the president in France can introduce such referenda. And because he lost the referendum that he was pushing for, he resigns because he promised that. And 2 years later, he dies while still writing his memoirs. So overall, what we need to understand is that as I said, that France cannot be understood both internally and externally without understanding de Gaulle. So that's why it is worth talking about de Gaulle. And more recently, it has been proven that some of the things he was talking about that have been sort of neglected for 50, 60 years now come back again, and maybe he had some good points to make, or maybe what he was saying was to a degree valid. So let's see what. So he's a fascinating figure. He is the political leader of the 20th century in France, the greatest figure in French politics in the 20th century for sure. And as I said, has fundamentally shaped France. So, and not so long ago, a new biography in English has been published about de Gaulle, and I will link that biography. You can find a link to that biography and all the references that further references and sources. You can find them as usual. There's a link in the description box to the web page of this podcast, where you find all the further sources and resources on the topics we discuss. So that's kind of the portrait of de Gaulle. So let's draw out a little some of these things that we talked about. So as I said, he's shaped first of all the French political system, right? Creating this presidential model in which the president is the most important political actor. In fact, the president in France is more powerful within the French political system than the US president is within the US political system. Again, what many people don't know, and I'm saying many people, this includes the majority of Americans, don't know and don't realize that the president in the United States is actually not very powerful position constitutionally within the political system. Constitutionally, Congress is by far the most powerful entity in the United States political system, and you just have to open the Constitution to realize that. We're talking within the political system, so the role of the president versus Congress and the court system at federal level. But anyway, so in France, the French president is overwhelmingly the most powerful actor. Lately, this has been moderated by increasing the power of parliament, but still, the president can dissolve parliament, can call for elections. He appoints a prime minister who then is approved by the parliament. He's, as I said, both head of state and actually head of government. He can refer laws to the constitutional court. It's overwhelming. And just the fact that the president can dissolve the National Assembly, it's ridiculous. So he shaped that. Then, as I said, he shaped party politics, creating this ideology of Gaullism, which is very interesting because it is, as I said, it bypassed the or it changed radically the previous models of center-right politics in France. French politics has been, after the French Revolution, has been divided basically between pro-French Revolution and against, or monarchists. That was a major division. Then there was the religious component, because the French Revolution was anti-religious, not non-religious or a-religious, but anti-religious. So you had the religious forces, you had the Catholic Party in the pre-war era, French being a majority Catholic country at that point, well, overwhelmingly Catholic country. But the right was never really overwhelmingly successful, or in a and these divisions, as I said, continued. And what de Gaulle did, and what Gaullism did, among many other things, is that it created a center right, which again was shaped by him, which took republicanism, i.e., the legacy of the French Revolution, and made it part of the center right. And that's the most important thing that happened. So what de Gaulle did, again, shaped on by his personality and his ethos and his cultural and social and political and historical outlook, is he created a center right that sort of encompasses or takes in the entirety of French history or legacy, which doesn't start at the French Revolution, meaning that's not year zero, as the left would do in certain forms of the left, or the post-French Revolution left. So it doesn't start there, but it starts with Charlemagne, or even before that, right? So it incorporates the entirety of French history, including the French Revolution. So it's a Republican center-right. It's not a monarchist center-right, which was condemned to being a fringe movement. It's not a religious center-right, which, again, would have condemned it to be, even today, especially a fringe movement. So he created a more broadly encompassing center-right, which is also very peculiar, because it is rooted in many of the things that he believed, for example, the role of the state, and a very important role given to the state. The state being seen, however, as the embodiment and the tool and the hand or the arm of the nation. So the most important thing is the nation here, but the state becomes its arm. So hence, when the state acts, it acts for the nation. So it's not a sort of an alien body that intervenes, well, at least theoretically, and oppresses the people, but it speaks for and acts for the good of the nation, and it is its tool. So hence, this is why the role of the state is higher in France, traditionally in France in the economy and in general, than for example an American would be used to. And that's also part of Gaullism, of center right, a strong role to the state. So it's a very unique conglomerate of things that, again, were shaped by him, hence the ideology being called Gaullism. Now, I would argue that now, in the last 10-15 years, they have been moving, the center right has been moving, well, the Gaullist center right has sort of shrinked, and especially with Macron, he created another sort of a center right, which is not a precise successor of the Gaullist parties, because there have been Gaullist parties since de Gaulle, actually, after his death and so on, but they maintain this ideology. So it doesn't follow that. So it's not a successor of Gaullist parties, but it's still, I would argue, within the ballpark, but with some significant changes. So there has been a movement sort of away, but not abandoning Gaullism, but sort of not remaining a strict successor of it. Still, Gaullism, the legacy of Gaullism is still defining for the French internal French politics. And internationally, or before we talk about international, the impact on France as an international actor, a few words about the economy, just in as a coda to the Gaullism discussion. The France has a market economy, right? And again, contrary to what people think most of the time, since actually in modern French history, most of the time France has been governed by center-right parties or parties on the right. There's this idea in America about French and are socialist and so on, and of course it's misinterpreted or misunderstood what socialism means. But no, actually France has been mostly governed by parties on the right, but it's a different kind of right. And again, this and here's what I was mentioning, the role of the state, the fact that the state plays a definite role in the French society and in the French economy in various forms. And the state runs the educational system, transportation system, and so there's a large role of the state in the economy, which Americans would not be used to. And there's a lot of state employees, therefore, right? Because all the teachers are state employees. In France, a large part of significant part of the labor force is employed by the state, actually, because, as I said, the state plays an important role. Okay, so the role of France internationally. So de Gaulle talked a lot about the grandeur of France, and that again remains sort of defines how all presidents and all French governments have run French international politics. The idea that France is a great nation, i.e. it has to have a great state with an important role internationally, and they would not let off of that. I mean, we should just think of the fact that de Gaulle managed to put France on the UN Security Council. Although France in World War II has been an occupied country. Of course, there were free French who fought with the Allies, but the same went for Polish. There were free Polish who fought with the Allies, and look at what happened with Poland after World War II. Yeah, it was abandoned to the Soviet Union, to communism. Soviet Union influence, control. And it's amazing that de Gaulle managed to come out of the whole World War II thing with basically imposing this idea that France is one of the victorious countries, which obviously it wasn't, in the sense of the country had been occupied. But just the fact that, for example, Germany was divided immediately after the war in 4 sections, right, like Berlin, the whole of Germany in 4 sections of control, and the 4 sections were controlled by the Soviet Union, England, United States, and France, ridiculously. Yeah, well, that was all due to de Gaulle, right? And it's because he was fierce in this pushing for sort of scratching for France a place in the world that is arguably much more potent than the actual power of France, the state, the actual state, the economy, the military, and so on. But this is also why France has developed nuclear weapons on its own, yeah, which now has become a big asset, not just for France, but for this idea of sovereign, of independent potential, military potential, and development for Europe, separate from the United States. Due to the acts of the current U.S. administration of threatening to take over Greenland and so on, so basically forcing the Europeans to do that, but also the current administration sort of asking the Europeans to do that. But as I said, I'm not sure they actually want it to happen once it happens. So anyway, this nuclear potential, recently Macron offered it as an umbrella to all the other to share it with all the other countries in Europe. UK also has nuclear potential, but it's shared with the US the way it is, the whole system is put together. So it's not independent. Well, now there has been agreement signed between France and a number of other countries in Europe by which France gives them the nuclear guarantee, which is huge, because until now it was the US guarantee to Europe. Yeah, but France jumped into this void of power because power doesn't like a void. In politics, voids of power are not don't last long. Someone will jump into it and fill that void. So anyway, so France jumped into this void and offered this nuclear potential. But all of this is due to back to de Gaulle, who pushed for this sort of a third position for France in international affairs during the Cold War. So neither nor. I mean, clearly it was on the western, on the part of the democratic, market economies of the West. Yeah, but it allowed itself to not be part of the West as controlled or as under the authority of the United States. So it wanted to be on the part of the West, but as a independent actor to a degree. Independent doesn't mean separated from Europe, because de Gaulle is also the person who was pushed for the reconciliation with Germany. He was a good friend of Konrad Adenauer, the first German chancellor after World War II. And also he was an important actor in building the European Union, back then called the European Community. So France as a leader in the European Union, as it were, but part of it. But what he didn't want to be is to be under the US sort of umbrella. And all this mistrust of the US and of the Anglos goes back to his experience in World War II. And again, if one reads the biographies, and I also linked a number of movies you can watch about de Gaulle, and there's a more recent one that I haven't seen because it literally just came out. It was presented at Cannes, but I'm very curious because it seems to be the biggest, the movie about de Gaulle, or featuring de Gaulle with the biggest budget yet, which we cannot be said of the previous movies, French movies. So anyway, he didn't want to be part of this U.S. umbrella, and this goes back to his experience in World War II, where one has to understand that what de Gaulle did. He was in exile in London. It was him, maybe a secretary, his wife, his children. And who was he? He was just a minor member of the French government. He wasn't the leader of France. He wasn't the president of France. He wasn't the prime minister of France. He wasn't the head of the army, of the military of France. Yeah, he was just a general, with a minor position in the government. And yet, he managed to construct out of nothing himself as the head of the government in exile, as it were, of basically the Free France, out of nothing. And then that was at the beginning of the war. And then throughout the war, he had to scratch and claw to himself. And it was always a back and forth. And if you read the interactions between him and Churchill and Roosevelt and so on, you will see how often they were annoyed with him, but also admired him. Because basically that's what he did, was continuously fighting and not giving up in this fight with them to claw for himself and for France privileges, recognition, and so on. Out of nothing, basically. Out of sheer force of will. Out of sheer force of personality. Out of personal relations. And he was stubborn and he was difficult and he annoyed them to no end. But then they didn't have any other alternative. But it's a complete miracle what he achieved. As I said, to come out of the war with being recognized, with France being recognized as one of the victors. How? Yeah. So he had a bitter experience in the war of this continuous fight, and he didn't trust fully, his Anglo-American partners. This is part of that legacy, as I said, because everything he did is all these effects that I'm mentioning were shaped by de Gaulle himself by his person, yeah. And we talk about Gaullism. Well, internationally, what he did for France and with France is also Gaullism, in the sense that it was his personality, his understanding of history, his conception, philosophy of what France should be, that shaped this. It all comes from de Gaulle himself, which makes it again very interesting to study, because he personally, it wasn't like an ideology he took from outside, or so he learned, or a philosophy adopted. No, it was his personality that sort of created a way of looking at politics that then shaped the French political system, the French party system, and France internationally. So France as this sort of a third actor internationally in the Cold War, who allowed itself to also talk to Russia, talk to China, if need be, to communist Romania, and also a tradition of unilateralism, that of French, as I said, part of the EU, but also always allowing itself to act unilaterally. And if you know anything of French politics and recent history, you know that France is never afraid of acting unilaterally. For example, in Africa, for example, again with the nuclear weapons, and there's many other occasions that we can point out. This unilateral means that the state acts on its own without coordinating with allies, not part of a sort of a multilateral framework of action, for example, with a UN mandate, or going to the Security Council and getting a mandate, or as Germany has it in its constitution that it always has to act internationally in a multilateral fashion. It's in its constitution, while France, its neighbor, doesn't have these qualms, and it all again goes back to de Gaulle. Also, maybe a less important thing. It's interesting that de Gaulle looked at his understanding of the world was what we could consider, I think, Mazzinian nationalism, in which sense civic, this idea that the world is made of nation states, nations of whom the states are their sort of, as I said, their tool, their arm. So the states speak for nations, and the world is made of nations. So a vision of the world is made of nations / nation states, which is not true, as I mentioned in other episodes of the podcast, and with other opportunities. The world is not made of nation states. But that was kind of how de Gaulle saw the world. And that explains also why he pushed so hard for France having sort of a unique position, because it's a zero-sum game, right? If the world is made of nations, then the French, who have states, then the French nation state, its power and its role internationally is what politics is all about internationally. I doubt that politics is about that, and the way politics works internationally does not work like that, actually, or quite like that. But it's an interesting point to mention. Okay, well, this about the sort of the general major points of impact, as I said, of de Gaulle's life. And as I said, this just to point out to the importance of understanding de Gaulle and of studying him, because as I said, he shaped French politics internally and externally. So doing that, studying de Gaulle, it's also a study in leadership. in a particular leader. So that's kind of what I would like to do now, is to sort of look at some of the interesting aspects that I sort of picked up from de Gaulle as a leader, right? Because everything else, all his impact comes from his role as a leader, his role as what he was as a person, as a thinker, and how he filled that role of a leader through his with his personality. So things about de Gaulle that are interesting: his vision of the world. So what was his, underlying all these things that I mentioned? Yeah, his visions of, a party, Gaullist party, and so on. Let's go deeper. Let's look at the sort of the foundations of his political thought. Yeah, sort of the political philosophy of de Gaulle, but the foundations thereof, which you can kind of draw out from what he said and from what has been written and shown about him. So first of all, it's interesting that he had his personality and his view of the world combined utter pragmatism with big picture politics, with big strategic sort of design. And all of this is rooted in a philosophy of history that he had. We all have a philosophy of history, which simply means a view, an understanding of what history is, yeah, i.e., how the world works, yeah. And his view of history was as almost completely immanent in the sense, or what he emphasized was the immanent nature of history, by which I mean the accidental nature of history. The fact that, very much like Machiavelli, although he's not a Machiavellian, yeah, he was guided by certain very clear values and so on, but Machiavelli as well, yeah, saw the world that we inhabit, the world of history, the world of this worldly events, as completely accidental, yeah. So there is a complete randomness to history, and this is very important to understand, because as a leader, yeah, you have to have a picture of how the world works in order to then guide your country, yeah, in this world. Now, he could guide his country when he became president, because he wrote a political system in which he truly was the big driver of France, yeah. And this is also why the president in France is mostly, since God is, again, since him, because this is what he was, is mostly in charge with the big picture politics, yeah, the grand strategy, while the prime minister is the one who runs is the administrator of the bureaucracy of the state itself, or the day-to-day running of the state. President is the big picture one, and again, since then, Macron as well, this is kind of what the president does. He doesn't get involved in the minutiae of economy and so on. De Gaulle didn't understand necessarily economy, right? But again, it just shows how much he shaped politics, that even today it works this way. So that's the role of the leader. He constructed a political system where he could do that, and he also had a strong party to back him in the National Assembly, the lower house of the parliament, the most relevant one, the most powerful one in France. The upper house, the Senate, is very weak. So he had a party which was Gaullist, which supported him. I mean, he was, adulated. Yeah, he was adored. He was worshipped to a degree by a large number of people and political elites in France. So they formed this party to support him. He never became a member of this party that supported him, yeah, of the Gaullist party. Because the presidency that he created was also, as I mentioned, this sort of imperial presidency, above politics, as it were, which is weird, because you cannot be above politics when you're part of politics. But again, that was de Gaulle. De Gaulle was a general, right? General de Gaulle. So, and the military is not part of politics. And he saw his role as maneuvering the nation, not the right, left, and so on, but this sort of a permanent trans-historical reality of the nation that obviously surpasses the daily squabbles between left and right. That's how he saw his role. That's how he saw what a leader should do with a nation state, as I said, and he created a system and the political context to do that. Yeah. So as a leader, in that political system, he could maneuver, navigate France Not all leaders can, because many political systems, as I said, the formal, head of state and of government have by far don't have by far the power that the president has in France. So he could do that. But in order to know how to navigate, France, you need to have a picture of history. Also because he was prone to grand thoughts, to grand strategies, which is a kind of interesting and absurd, because if history is completely accidental and you can never, it means that you can never foresee what will happen. So how can you create a strategy when what will happen is completely accidental? This clash, is part of what the goal was, and it's very interesting because that explains a lot of his actions and so on. The ongoing thing about his grand strategy was, I said, it was the primordial and primary role of the nation, of the French nation, whatever that means, and using the state to serve that, that was his, strategy, and anything for that goal, that would brings to mind, right, realism in international politics, the realist school, which think of the world made of states, and the raison d'etat, meaning the state interest being the governing force in international relations. I think de Gaulle would have subscribed to a good part of that, to a degree. He also had a root in his values that go back to his sort of background and to his religious background. He was a Catholic. He was educated at Catholic schools. Although his religiousness, we cannot look into some person's soul, seemed more formal than not. But he attended mass regularly and so on, which was normal at the time, at least in a part of the French society. So it wasn't something extraordinary. It was also a social thing to do, meaning it was socially normal, so we don't know how deep it went, and he didn't talk about this, and it wasn't as prominent as, let's say, in the case of Adenauer, who was a Christian Democrat, and where his political thought was shaped by the social teaching of the Catholic Church, Catholic social teaching, very clearly and in a declared fashion. But still, there was this root in values, cultural, social, culturally, socially, maybe diluted, but still the values of religion, of Christianity, of Catholicism, of the Catholic Christianity. So he was guided by that. So he's not amoral like a Machiavelli, or to a degree like one could argue the realist school would be of international relations, when anything is permitted, in the goal, anything and everything is subordinate to the raison d'etat, to the interest of the state. But anyway, so one is this idea of history as completely fickle series of accidents, history as completely imminent, and yet this propensity for grand strategy, and you always fail when you create grand strategies in politics, in the sense of trying to predict the future and then adapt to that. It doesn't work. It never works, and it didn't work in his case either. But it's an interesting combination, as I said. This another aspect of de Gaulle was his political pragmatism, which follows from this idea of history, of imminent reality as completely fickle, accidental, and so on. You don't know what will, you never know what will come. Things can change from one day to the other. Pragmatism means that you have to shape your actions based on that, and he was a pragmatist. So no matter his big words and so on a day-to-day basis, he was a pragmatist. He took reality as it is. things as they came. Yeah. And that also kind of leads us to another aspect, which is interesting, that he was actually quite a good political operator in his own way. Just think, as I said, of the fact that he created a political, or supported the creation of a party that supported him while he was out of politics. So between 45 and 58, he wasn't in politics, but there was a party that supported him. What does it mean? Which he kind of maneuvered from the background and so on. And he was sort of fond of this maneuvering in the dark, and of this minute strategy of day-to-day politics, which again goes kind of contrary to his idea, to this picture of the president or of the Gaulle being above, beyond, outside politics, because it's the opposite, right? But that's part of it. It's part of this thing. So he was a political operator, but a political operator that always sort of maintained a specific distance, in the sense of he maneuvered, but he maneuvered indirectly. He maneuvered letting other people do the thing, or the dirty work, and him not getting involved. So having effects, and being involved, and yet keeping himself formally out of it, which kind of, you see where it comes from and how it combines all the things that we just mentioned. Another aspect of him as a leader, which was interesting to note, was his populism. Yeah, the fact that he was deeply committed, well, for whatever reasons, to the idea of of politics relying on popular support, which again would go sort of theoretically, at least, against this the imperial idea of the presidency or imperial presidency. Yet it doesn't. Yeah, in his case, because you would think, oh, if it's an imperial president, then it's he should be autonomous from the people's will. But that's not how he governed, and it's not how he defined philosophically his role as a president. But I don't even know how one of the authors called it. I think it is a republican, republican monarchy, elective monarchy, something like that. There was an expression. So basically, a president who's like a monarch, but a monarch who is elected by the people. Yeah, which the two things go against each other. That you can't have both. But that's kind of how he. That's kind of the presidency that the Gaulle created, and he was very much focused and convinced of the importance of popular support, while yet not getting for example, yeah, he liked to mingle in the population with the big events, taking sort of these popular baths, so baths of population. There's a bain du peuple, yeah. So bathing yourself in the populace, but this connection remained symbolic, remained never became personal. Yeah, so it wasn't like a Bill Clinton who liked to shake hands, and he was like shake everyone's hands and look you in the eye and gave you the full. So he was a person-to-person operator, and he liked to mingle with the regular people and have this personal relationship. The Gaulle didn't have these personal relationships. He had very few personal relationships. He had people who admired him, followed him. He had some close advisors, among them philosophers, writers, but he really only had close connections with his family. Otherwise, he was a fairly cold person, fairly standoffish, even with his political collaborators and so on. Yeah, so he wasn't one to, like Bill Clinton, this again, car salesman type. He comes, he sits at your table and drinks with you and so on. No. The connection remains sort of between a monarch and his people. Yeah, the distance remains while the connection also remains. Yeah, sort of in a way. So it's a very interesting thing. But he was convinced, and it was very important for him to understand where the people stand, and knowing, and that's how he guided his politics, that he in a way, he made sure, he had to make sure, yeah, he always wanted to make sure that all policies are popularly supported. Yeah, so he only understood politics as rooted in popular support. So in this Republican idea of constitutional, of representative democracy, yeah, that the people in power represent the people. In his case, mostly symbolically. Although don't forget that he is also the person who changed the election of the president to from being elected by a sort of an electoral college to being directly elected by the people. Also, again, as part of this idea of the relationship with the president and the nation. I think this is the best way to put it. He looked at the people not as individuals, as the nation. So this connection was very important, and the support of the nation is very important. The people as the nation, and this bang du peuple, yeah, were very important. But it remained a connection that it was one of representation, not of I'm one of you. Yeah, in that sense. So an interesting kind of populism. Yeah, so not populism in the negative sense of empty rhetoric and empty promises and balloons being sent out, but this idea of politics needs to always make sure that it goes with what the people think, and you cannot push beyond what the people want, even if you would want. You can try to maneuver them, to convince them, but you cannot go beyond what the people accept. It's again part of his pragmatism, and in many ways seeing this popular support or the moods of the people as maybe as part of the accidental immanent nature of history, of immanent reality. So I mentioned that the Gaulle was warm and personable and immediate only with his with his family, basically. And it's interesting to see in these movies and in many of the media produced in France about de Gaulle, the emphasis on this personal aspect of de Gaulle. It's a weird emphasis looking from the outside, because there's a movie, one of the movies that you can find in the references, is basically focused on him, of the private de Gaulle. Yeah. So it's interesting because I'm not that interested in that necessarily. It's a part of him, but I wouldn't focus a movie on that. But it shows you how, sort of, in many ways, indirectly, it shows you the remoteness of the de Gaulle figure in French consciousness, and how he was this sort of distant idol in a way, and remains in the French consciousness. So much so that the groundbreaking thing is when you show that he was actually human. Yeah, because that's why you would emphasize the private part, the private life. Yeah, because if everything you know about him is basically engulfed in the public, sort of this distant sort of image, and an interesting aspect about his private, as I said, life was the fact that that's the only place where he was actually warm and fully human in a way, and especially with regards to one of his children, which was a daughter with special needs. He had a particular fondness, and many of the materials insist on this, on his particular fondness to his special needs daughter, who died young, but he was deeply, deeply fond of her. And that's where he's at his most vulnerable. Yeah, you can see him at his most vulnerable in his letters and so on. But his standoffishness, his coldness, his remoteness, in many occasions, people who behave that way, they do this because they are actually very vulnerable. They're very sensitive and vulnerable, and and this is a way publicly to protect themselves, yeah, and to obtain the results while protecting themselves. So that's a common strategy, and I think this was true for de Gaulle. It's not something I have read or seen, but it's my, as I said, it's my interpretation. It is my explanation. also, it's interesting that uh, he was a man of, which kind of taps into the same thing, or connects with the same thing, that he was a man of fluctuating moods, and moods were important. Yeah, which again is something that people who have a powerful emotional internal life emotionally would be swung by moods, right? If they allow that to happen. You don't have to be sensitive and also be swung by moods, but he was. Um, and which so alternating between extremes, yeah, alternating between depression or depressive, yeah, moods, and abandonment, yeah, basically giving up, and periods of strong will and let's do it, and so on. This too was part of his emotional sort of makeup. What are some? So this were I found all of these interesting to in order to understand the Gaulle as the leader. All these aspects of how he saw the world, and how he understood the role of politics and the role of leadership, his political philosophy. Yeah, I think um, it was worth investigating, because it explained a lot about him beyond the daily actions. So let's see now what are some of the lessons, as it were, that we can draw from his life work. Basically, from everything I said. So as I said, the first one is this dynamic of democratic politics, and also, more importantly, the role of leaders. And this is something interesting. Again, it goes to the bigger discussions about politics. The model, yeah, in the world right now, in the Western world, is that of representative democracy, the standard. Yeah, not direct democracy. The people are not directly in power, as in ancient Athens. They don't get to directly vote on laws. Traditionally, that was considered to be one of the worst systems of government, because it's basically mob rule, and it has been proven to be that over and over again. It's representative democracy, by which people elect representatives, so you filter the will of the people, and empower a smaller number of people to govern in the name and for the interest of the people, but guided by reason, and following the common good, and not guided by the mob's irrational impulses, and so on. So it's a government rooted in the whose legitimacy rests with the people, and but is exercised by a number of representatives. And the embodiment of this government is the parliament, yeah, not the head of the state, head of the government, yeah. That's the embodiment of representative democracy. Is the parliament, is the whatever the name is in different countries, whatever you call them, Congress in the United States, National Assembly and Senate in France, the Bundestag, Bundesrat in Germany, whatever the National Assembly, as it were, in Hungary, whatever it is. Point is that that's where this principle of representative democracy is embodied, yeah, because that's where the representatives of the different factions in the population, yeah, each get their own voice, and these various voices, differing voices from the society, get this framework, which is the parliament, to express these different viewpoints, and through internal rules of functioning, and through majority voting in parliament, reach an agreement, which is usually a compromise between these different voices. That's what parliaments do. Parliaments are the representative voice of the people, yeah, not whoever is the head of state, head of government. And yet, people usually don't understand and dislike elected bodies like parliaments. In the United States, Congress has the lowest approval rating compared to, let's say, generally speaking, the president, because it just seems too complicated. Because people want simplicity, and actually people want a leader to lead. And this takes us to the goal, because as I said, the goal, and I'm not saying that's good because it's not, yeah? Because that goes against the principle of representative democracy. People want representative democracy in theory, but in practice, they want a leader to tell them what to do, and it's a fact. As annoying as that sounds for people, for the hubris of the individual, yeah, because we want representative democracy because we want to have power, want to have a say. It's our hubris, yeah. I want to be in power, but then when you are in power, because you get to vote and you have a parliament, you get annoyed that they bicker all the time. Well, they bicker all the time because that's why we send them there, because you bicker with your neighbor or with the other person because you don't agree. If you would all agree, you would send people who agree, but you don't agree. Hence, they bicker because the choice is either they bicker in parliament peacefully or you punch each other in the society, because the reality is that in a society, human beings don't agree. Yeah, but we have found a mechanism of transferring this inherent conflict that exists inherently in a society into an organized sort of a framework where there's rules of the game, and where this conflict is mediated and transformed into common policy making. It's a miracle that this works. People don't understand this, yeah? So they like the idea of representation of democracy, which is actually representative democracy, but they get annoyed with parliament because they want some clear leadership. It's human, but it's real. And they also want something simple, and they want to be policy is complicated. They want to invest their hopes and fears and whatever in a person. So actually, we hate the idea of one guy in charge of everything, but we want one guy to be in charge of everything. That's the truth. But my guy means simply that you invest him sort of symbolically with trust. Well, you invest in his trust, and you put your trust in a person. So it's interesting that politics is actually very personal. That it is about this sort of a personal investment with trust, and I don't understand what he's doing, but I trust him personally, and that's why I follow the leader. Yeah, this is why people sign up for all kinds of stupid and get to follow all kinds of stupid policies, because they have previously invested trust in this leader, and it's very hard to critically examine that investment of trust, yeah, because most people don't have the tools to do that. I mean, most people don't follow, and they shouldn't necessarily follow politics or understand policy, and we have our own business every day, right? So the shortcut to it is investing with trust in the leader. Why I say this is because, but this happens to various degrees, yeah. So there's countries where which lean more culturally towards a more shared governance, more parliamentary type governance, and there's countries which lean more towards the need for a strong leader. Generally speaking, people like to have clear leaders, but there's cultural differences, and there's different societies which, in the sense that some need clear leadership more, or one person in charge more than others. And France, and I would say most Latin countries, I think it's part of the Latin meaning Romance, yeah, Romance language based on the Latin language, like French, France, Italy, Spain, need and like to have a clear leader, and when they have parliamentary systems, it's highly fragmented. So it's part of political culture and temperament, so to speak. And that has been proven over and over again. Yeah, French politics, parties system is highly fragmented, always was, still is. Italian one as well, and so on. And the goal, I don't know if he sensed this, or it was just his need to be a leader in a political system which gives him the tools to actually be a leader. But he was pushing for this in opposition to the, as I said, post-World War II political system of France, which was a parliamentary system. In the post-World War II French political system, which is the Fourth Republic, yeah, because it was the fourth Republican constitution since the French Revolution. So the so-called Fourth Republic, which was after World War II, and which collapsed in 1958. it was a parliamentary system where parliament had the most power, which means that government is the head of government is the prime minister, but the prime minister governs a government of ministers based on who wins the parliamentary elections. So there's only one. The important elections are parliamentary elections, and whichever party or parties win the parliamentary elections get to form the government and appoint prime minister. Yeah, in a highly fragmented society, politically, socio-politically, etc., or culturally and politically, as the French one, and in most Latin countries, the resulting thing is that you will have many parties in parliament. So for the formation of government sometimes will be very difficult, or governments will be sort of chronically unstable, because all those parties, in order to form a government, have to have a majority. None of the parties has a majority in the parliament because there's so many. So they form coalitions, but those coalitions, because it's so fragmented, depend on 1 to 7 parties, and one party drops off, the government loses its support in parliament, and you have to form a new government. Not new elections, but you have a new government by finding another partner to join the coalition. So there's this fickleness, instability, deep instability, and that characterized French politics after after World War II. And yet, I mean, it was a highly that government of the those governments of the Fourth Republic had huge achievements in economically, politically, internationally, and so on. But internally, they were, as I said, unstable. Every 6 months, basically, in that period, you had a new government. Yeah, not new government completely, but rehashing, reshaping. Yeah, that led to the fact that when a big crisis came, there was no one to actually respond to it, because there was no strong leader, maybe for other reasons as well, but specifically because to be a strong leader in the parliamentary system, you need to have a strong parliamentary support, which nobody had implicitly and explicitly and inherently because of that fragmentation. So when he came in, de Gaulle created a presidency that rests on its own legs, because it's directly elected by the people, separately from parliament. So he does not depend on the parliament. In fact, he can dissolve the parliament and call for new elections. He still needs parliament to pass laws, but he can do direct or pass ordinances and so on. So can even govern alone, the president, which is crazy, because we talk about representative democracy. So anyway, but this model clearly, and this was the point I mentioned earlier, clearly it worked, and it has been tweaked since, and especially in the last 20-25 years, the National Assembly, the Parliament has acquired more power, and there's more checks on the president's power, and the mandate of the president has been reduced from, it used to be 7 years, while of the Parliament is 4 or 5 years. So now it has been reduced itself to, I think, 5 years. But it used to be 7 years. 2 mandates, 14 years. That's gigantic. Yeah, a president for 14 years. That's too long in modern politics. But he created a system, and this is the point, that fit him, but also fit the French society. And that's the point. That's why it has lasted, because the French society does need a system which has a clear leader. And there are other, as I said, Latin countries, I would argue Romania is one of them, where a parliamentary system would not work. Because of this fragmentation, you need to have a pole of power that is separate, not independent, not going haywire, but separate and standing on its own legs, because that fits the political culture, the temperament better. So that's an interesting aspect to take from again, the history and the activity of de Gaulle, that he, by design, by his own needs, by his own nature, shaped a political system that fit the French culture, while the previous one, French political culture, while the previous one clearly did not. And I think this is an important lesson to draw. And as I said, it also points to a bigger issue, which sort of characterizes modern politics or current politics, the fact that still remains, as I said, that we like the idea of representative democracy, but at the same time we kind of want a clear leader. At the same time, as I said, for example, Scandinavian countries are more collaborative and cooperative socially, yeah, and more sort of horizontal, yeah, sort of everybody is equal. It's part of the ethos there, yeah. Even rich people, for example, in Denmark, they will not flaunt their richness. It's just not part of culture. There's a culture of modesty and so on, broadly speaking, and of egalitarianism, yeah, um, um, and of cooperative action. So their parliamentary systems work much better in such cultures. While in other cultures, I said, I would argue the Latin Romance sort of cultures, typically they need a clear leadership of some sort, or some arrangement when there's one sort of clear north star. I'm thinking of Spain here, which has a parliamentary system, but it's a constitutional monarchy, and it's very important that they needed and they reestablished the monarchy because that became the anchor that stabilized the society. So there is a North Star, although even if the monarch is not head of government, it plays an important role in stabilizing, sort of balancing, and, as I said, stabilizing Spanish politics and society. Other interesting aspect of the Gauls that we can draw from the history of the Gaul is, as I said, how one in this fickle, imminent history, if we follow the Gauls' vision of surrounding reality, historical reality, yeah, how the importance of shaping this reality and the capacity that leaders have, or should have, or politicians can have, or human beings, of creating reality, meaning of shaping this immanent reality. Even if it's accidental, you can also shape it and create realities. Yeah, and I'm thinking here, as I said, to what he did in exile, where he basically, out of nothing, created the French government in exile, a free French army. He himself made himself into a leader. Yeah, and here is also the role, the importance of symbolic acts. Yeah, he was very aware, de Gaulle was, of the power of symbolic acts. For example, as I said, liberating Paris. The fact that it was de Gaulle and the Free French Army that liberated Paris. Well, it wasn't. Literally, they were like a column of I don't know, 3-4 cars, broadly speaking, maybe one tank, like literally like five vehicles that entered Paris under the name of the Free French, but they were the first, so they liberated Paris. Why? Because they wanted to be this idea of French independence, yeah, of not having the Anglos or the Americans liberating Paris and then depending on them, and then them running France, but him entering, and then basically the French liberate France, yeah, liberating Paris in a centralized state is liberating France to a degree, and also himself, de Gaulle, being the one there because that gave him control over the situation. So he was very keen, and the same with the Bain de Peuple, these bats of populace, yeah. Various events that he organized to commemorate, for example, liberation and so on during his reign. The way he addressed the population in order to maintain his stature as a leader, as I said, the idea that you create reality. I mean, it is important, he learned, yeah, from, for example, the speeches he gave, yeah. So just think of the fact that he acquired his position as leader of the Free French and of the France in exile, of the Free France, through speeches on the radio. He had nothing. He didn't have troops. He had, as I said, his wife, maybe a secretary, and then, but he had access to the microphones of the BBC, which again he obtained through all kinds of threats and maneuvering, because at first the British didn't want to give him time and the opportunity to address the French, but then in a way they needed him, and then he was again pestering them, and he was obstinate. He created his access to the microphone, yeah, one of the earliest use of media in politics in this sense, of the use that, through simple speeches from an office in the BBC, he became the leader of France. A nobody. Nobody knew him in the general public. Yeah, as I said, he was a colonel, wrote some books, then made a general. But there were so many generals. Was a minor member in the cabinet at the time of surrender. He was nobody, broadly speaking, but he created himself. Yeah, he created himself through the use of media. One of the earliest, basically, such achievements, right? By and it, if you look at the background of it, it was, there was no fanfare behind him getting access to BBC microphones. It was maneuvering and shouts and arguments and blackmailing and this and the other thing that he did to get this. But by getting this, people at the other end, at the radios in France, they didn't know what was the background. It was a voice, general, speaking for the Free French. He created himself. So that's a very interesting aspect of, again, someone who thinks in such big, like the Gaulle, who thinks in such big pictures and history, and, as I said, being actually a talented operator and a talented politician in that sense. Although he, as a position like himself, he was outside of politics. It was actually deeply, in indirect fashions, in various ways, a deeply involved political operator, but never as part of, for example, party politics, but indirectly. He used, for example, his distance from politics, his position as not part of the squabbling, of political squabbling, as a tool to influence the political squabbling. For example, he knew, another thing he did, he knew that the best way to keep yourself in public eye is to create conflicts. Because when you create conflicts, people's attention is drawn to you and your stature is elevated. It's basically, scandal papers used in, the use of scandal papers in the media, right? TMZs, but used in politics. And he knew this, and he did it consciously, creating conflicts, keeping conflicts alive, because that elevated his position and draw the attention of people to him. So, as I said, a fascinating figure. I'm sometimes check my notes here just to make sure that I touch on everything I want to touch. So a fascinating figure, beyond just the achievements that everybody knows about. I found it very interesting and fascinating to delve more deeply into his fundamental philosophy, philosophy of politics, political philosophy of history, because every political action is rooted in a philosophy of history and a political philosophy following from that, and also into some of what we can learn from his incredible career. And again, incredible. The closer you look, you realize how, as with everything, how what outside shines so brightly, or it's such a, just the headlines are very shiny, but go beyond that and you see, just like with every achievement or every trajectory, that it's daily work and it's dirty work, and you have to get dirty, and it's struggle, and it's not linear, and it's up and down, and it's depression, and it's victory, and it's depression, it's fight, and that's the path. There's no other path. It's this daily struggle. But it's interesting to dive into that and to see what we can learn both at micro and at a macro level. The second item I want to bring up today As usual, the second item is a short, brief discussion, usually about a piece of media or something, or a very particular item that I want to bring to your attention. In this case today is I want to draw your attention to a British panel show called "Have I Got News for You?" Panel shows are a very I'm not saying that the British invented them, but they're very it's a very widespread model on British TV. There are all kinds of comedy panels and news panels and so on, competition panels in which you have an ongoing cast of moderators and then ever changing list of guests doing a thing. Yeah. So, for example, one of the best panel shows at the moment is called "Would I Lie to You?" And basically, you have team captains and a moderator, and the two teams, basically each individual has to read a story, and the others have to basically guess whether or not this is true, it happened to them or not, and it is incredibly entertainment, even if I made it boring. Hopefully not. But that's not the one I want to mention. I'm just saying this is a genre that the British have really developed, and they're really good at that. I haven't seen it in any other societies done at such level. Because you also need to have a sense of irony and of humor that they have. But this one, "Have I Got News for You?" is very apropos, yeah, of this podcast, because it is about politics. It is about news, and it's actually maybe the longest lasting panel show on British TV. It's been going on for 35 years with the same people, meaning there's two team captains, and then there's these panel shows usually function as a mock competition. Teams get points, but none of that matters. So this is why team captains. So there's Ian Hislop and Paul Merton, the two team captains, which have been the same since the 90s when this panel show started, and each of them has two guests every week. And then there's a moderator. There used to be one moderator, but now that rotates as well. The person who brings up the topics. And what this is, it's a weekly show about current events in British politics and maybe also international, but it's a humorous panel. And well, the fact that it has been going on for 35 years should tell you something. And the reason why it's so successful is, and why I want to bring it to you, is because it's really good. It's really good in what sense? In the sense of if you want to keep in touch with, or just dip your toes into what's happening in British politics, look at from the inside. And that's the only way to understand politics, is to look at it from the inside and understand it on its own terms, on the terms of the people inside that political society. That's the only way to understand politics in a country. You should never judge politics in a country with the measures of your own political system, because it doesn't apply. Different political cultures need different things and function differently. So anyway, if you want to get that internal sort of comparative politics perspective, this is a perfect sort of weekly. You can dip your toes into it. Plus, it's very, very entertaining. That's one reason. And also, I recommend it this way because it is well informed, very well informed, and the level is pretty high in the sense it's not high in the sense of being complicated, but let me put it this way: there have been other political panel shows that have disappeared in the meantime, yeah. And the reason is because they were very, like, for example, I would mention Mock the Week, which I always consider to be a very lowbrow, because it didn't really understood what they were talking about politics, and it was mostly silly jokes or stupid jokes, yeah. Some of them very good jokes as jokes, but not. You didn't really understand what was going on. It was more like, politicians are stupid, sort of a thing, yeah. That's not informative. This is a well-informed, and a sort of an insider almost look into British politics, and this is due to obviously the producers of the show, but also to the presence of Ian Hislop, who is actually in his day job, as it were. He's an editor of a weekly satirical current affairs magazine, Private Eye, and he's been that for probably 30 years as well. So he is the highly informed, understanding the minutiae of politics person, and also satirical, ironic, humorous. While Paul Merton is more the comedian there, but also who's been doing this for a long time, and is more rooted into what he's talking about. So you have this quality then of the two important actors who bring this quality, plus the production team. Yeah. Then the guests are fantastic because they have as guests top-notch politicians who've just been in a scandal. They can bring them on, up-and-coming politicians. They can also have guests, writers, public figures, other comedians. So it's a good mix of guests. Some of them. So it's not just comedians. Yeah. So that's very important. Yeah, which wasn't true for Monk the Week. It is public figures. Yeah. So Boris Johnson, in many ways, made his career in a way, or public persona, or created his reality as a public persona, came to the attention of the public to the attention of the public, especially through participating on Have I Got News for You. His showings have been memorable, and that's when he really catapulted into the public attention. So having politicians, people from politics, newspaper people, so not just comedians, that again elevates the discussion, and it remains humorous and ironic because the whole panel is about making fun of this, or pointing out absurdities and so on. But it is done at a different level. This doesn't mean that, from my perspective, it doesn't mean that it doesn't have its weaknesses. This show, let's say, if I would do it, they haven't asked yet. For example, this plagues all of British media. It's all kind of leaning in one direction. Yeah, but this is not outrageous. Yeah, Ian Hislop especially is more of a center, in the center of politics, or able to criticize all sides very harshly. But there is a leaning, yeah, more into one direction, which is not, and that's annoying because in a way you could make it even more biting, yeah, if you would be free from any sort of what's comme il faut, yeah. What is the, let's go mainstream, yeah. And the mainstream is sort of the public mainstream, the media mainstream is sort of leaning in one direction, but just leaning. And as I said, this overall, as I said, they have no qualms in punching in all directions and hitting in all directions and criticizing in all directions. But I think it could be done at even more biting level, because why not? So it's a fantastic show. It is truly funny. Reminds me of the other famous show that is one of the best political TV shows in history, I would argue, right? Which was Yes Minister and Yes Prime Minister, which was a sort of a sitcom, but not a stupid one, but a sitcom that showed politics, the level of government in its daily work, with huge accuracy and yet with biting satire. So the Brits are good at doing that. And I would put Have I Got News to You at kind of that level, but as a panel show. So I deeply, I warmly recommend it. And in the resources, in the sources and resources to this episode, which, as I said, you can find on the webpage of this podcast, which is linked in the description of the video. You find links to some famous episodes of Have I Got News for you, and also to the official page on BBC. You can also watch it in America. You can watch it on YouTube. There's many episodes on YouTube, various channels. Put them up. And right now, I think they just concluded the 71st season of the panel show. Have I Got News for You? Well, this was it. Thank you for paying attention, if you have. And I will see you with the full episode on the first Monday of September. or thereabouts. There can be a 1-2 days fluctuation there depending on events, but basically the first Monday of the month is when you should find another full episode. In between, as you have noticed, I have introduced something called intermezzo. So that's in the middle of the month. It's a shorter ad hoc sort of a discussion on a immediate of a topic in the immediate reality that we're inhabiting. Those are more off the cuff. So main episodes first Monday of the month. In the middle of the month, basically the third Monday of the month, and thereabouts, you have the intermezzo. So I'll see you with a full episode on the first Monday of September, and I'll see you with an intermezzo mid-August. Thank you so much. Hope you enjoyed it.